Chris Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'd like to talk about getting a Horary reading. Horary astrology is one of the 4 main types of traditional astrology. Now, most people are familiar with natal astrology. In fact, they consider that to be astrology. And natal astrology is looking at birth charts. Horary astrology is quite different, however. What it does is look at the chart of a question. And that immediately raises the question of, well, how does it work? Of course, that problem is true for natal astrology as well. I mean, why does the time of your birth make a difference? Basically, what it shows with Horary astrology and natal astrology as well is that everything in the cosmos is connected with chains of spiritual correspondence and sympathy. There are these underlying spiritual cycles, and we can see the cycles in the heavens very clearly. They can chart them, in 1,000 years in the past and 1,000 years into the future. And because these cycles are very obvious, they reflect the underlying spiritual cycles very obviously. And so by looking at the heavens, we can also see these deeper spiritual cycles that are affecting events on Earth. And so a Horary question, essentially, when we look at, the Renaissance view of reality, they saw our body, our passions, our emotions as being under the control or really cycling with the heavens. And so when we ask a Horary, it needs to be a serious question, one that affects us emotionally. And so at that point, there's a connection between our emotions, our passions, and the heavens. And then if we actualize that question, if we talk to an astrologer and ask that question of an astrologer at that point, then we've completed the circuit. And we're able to get an accurate answer to that question from looking at the chart of the question, which is quite amazing. And so, that brings up sort of the first question that people have as well. Why are you looking at the chart when you receive the question? Because that's what I do. Rather than looking at the time of the asked question, the time that the person who's asking the question, had the question and their location, I use the time, date, and location that I, as the astrologer, received the question. And like I said, what's going on here is that we're completing the circuit. Because it's probably an issue you've been thinking about for a while, something that's been on your mind for a while, but it's not really born. It's not really actualized as a Horary question until you go to the astrologer and ask that question. And my experience is that the received chart, the one that I use for my time, date, location, gives a more objective and more accurate view of the circumstances. The asked chart seems to be colored by the emotions of the person asking the question. So if they're in a negative mood, it makes the Horary more negative, more than inaccurate in that way, or more positive. So that's why I found that using the received chart, and that's also William Lilly, who's probably the most famous Horary astrologer, that's what he says to do. He says, if you receive a letter, and the person's not right in front of you asking the question, then again, you're going to use the time that you receive to understand the question. And so Horary astrology really is my favorite form of astrology, and it really is incredibly accurate. People say, well, how accurate is it? My experience is it's somewhere between 70 to 90% accurate in my practice. I very rarely have people coming back to me and saying that you got it wrong. More typical is someone saying, well, yep, you were right. Just what you said, that's exactly how it came out. And it's amazing how often a Horary chart can really nail the situation. I never cease to be amazed by how closely the Horary chart can actually correspond to the situation that we're looking at. So what do you need for a Horary question? And the advantage here is that you don't need your birth chart. That surprises people because that's what they're used to. But since we're dealing with the birth of the question, you don't need your birth chart. And that's very helpful because many people don't have the exact time of their birth. So anybody can make use of Horary astrology because all you have to do basically is ask the question. So really the best time to ask a question, and sometimes people worry, they say, well, if I ask the question at a different time, would I get a different answer? And no, actually, what I found is that if you time your question by your emotions, in other words, you wait till you really want to know the answer for a serious question, that's the absolute best time to ask the question. What you definitely don't want to do is to try to elect the time for Horary astrologically. In fact, if you can be ignorant of what the heavens are doing right now, that's the best state to be in. Because what you're doing is if you elect the question or you try to fiddle around and get a good time, is that you're essentially kind of monkeying with the answer. It's like taking all the negative cards out of a tarot deck and then trying to use it for prediction. You can force a positive answer, but you can't get an accurate answer. And so basically that's important to keep in mind when you're asking the horary. Now, what do you do to ask a horary question? Well, if you want to ask me a horary question, what you would do is first go to my website and you want to order a horary and do the payment. You can do the payment through PayPal or credit card. And if you look at the top of the website, on any page it has payment, and you can just go to horary. Now, I don't want to get this video outdated, so I won't mention the price that I typically charge, but it is possible to get a discount if you order 3 at once. And then also, if you need an immediate answer, you can do an emergency horary. Now, that's double price. And what you need to do for that is to contact me to make sure I'm available that day and can do the emergency horary. Now, normally, when I do a horary, it's going to take me anywhere from 5 to 10 days to turn that around. That's because I have a lot of clients, a lot of people waiting to get their answers, and I really have to go on a first-come, first-served basis in order to be fair to everybody. So as I said, you can get 3 horaries if you order them all at once. You can get a discount, but you need to order them all at once. You can't do one and then order another and then say, oh, well, I ordered, this is my 3rd one, can I have a discount? No, you need to order them all at once. And so let's talk a little bit about what kind of questions can be asked using horary. Now, the best way to ask a horary question is to ask a single focused yes or no question. So, for example, will I marry X? Will I get the job at Y Corp? Should I invest with Z? Those are all excellent questions. Am I cursed? A yes or no question really focuses the inquiry. Now, you're going to get more information than just yes or no, but we really need to have that focused inquiry. Now, for example, it's not really possible to ask an either-or question. Should I move to Boston or to Los Angeles? I mean, that's 2 questions basically, and I'm not going to be able to tell the difference between Boston and Cleveland in the same chart. It's technically possible to ask more than one question, even though they're unrelated in one chart, but I wouldn't want to do that because all the answers are in the same chart. They're all mixed in, muddled together. And again, that makes it very technically difficult, and it's so difficult to get an accurate answer out of that I just can't do that. Another thing that you really can't ask in terms of a horary question is a how question. It's similar to a when will I. What you're doing in a how or a when will I question is you're assuming a positive answer. When will I be elected president? Well, chances are you won't. How do I become a multi-billionaire? Well, again, chances are that you won't. You need to understand that horary is going to give you the likely outcome of the circumstances. Okay, it's predictive. What is going to happen? It does not exist to give us a way to make them come out the way we want. This is actually an accurate view of reality, an accurate method of predicting the future, and therefore sometimes you're going to get a yes and sometimes you're going to get a no. And so that's really important to keep in mind. You don't want to ask a horary question unless you're going to be willing to accept either a yes answer or a no answer. And I do sometimes get clients that are looking, I think, unconsciously for reassurance, and that can be dangerous. When will I get a job? That's a question that often I'll say to people, look, is it really going to be helpful to you to get a no answer? And oftentimes they think, oh, I didn't even think that was possible. They're just sort of at the end of the rope, and they're like, when am I going to get a job? No, that's not what this is. That's not going to work very well. On the other hand, if you're looking to see exactly what's going to happen, and you're ready to have either a yes or no answer, then horary is really perfect for getting an accurate view of what's coming up in the situation. So let's go on and talk a little bit more about what type of questions can be asked using horary. First of all, the question really needs to be serious. That's usually not a problem because when clients are paying, they're obviously not going to pay in a situation that's not serious. However, another aspect to that is it really needs to be a question that's personal to you, and that's visceral to you, that you have an emotional stake in. Because the further you get away from yourself, with the less emotional stake, again, there's less contact with that. We're talking about the circuit of the heavens. And so, for example, celebrity questions or political questions, unless you're directly involved, are, in my experience, not very accurate in horary. Now, sometimes it's possible to do it. I know William Lilly used to do political questions. I've never been able to have much success with those sort of questions. It also can begin to be a bit of a problem if you're talking about my brother's, barber's, sister's dog. I mean, the further you get away from yourself, like I said, the less visceral it is and the less accurate it is. Now, for example, if you want to ask about your daughter's marriage or your husband's job, obviously that's something that's, important to you, even though it's not completely personal. In those cases, you can ask that type of question, but the better course would be to talk to them and say, hey, I'm thinking of asking this astrologer this question, and make sure that, that they know about it. That way, essentially, you just become a messenger, and it becomes their question. And from a technical standpoint, that's a lot easier for me to answer as an astrologer than having to do, so you ask about someone else, I have to turn the chart. It's a technical, methodological technique that I use. And it makes it harder to judge the chart and harder to get an accurate answer. So it's great if you can just talk to them and say, hey, I'm worried about this situation. Is it okay if I ask this astrologer on your behalf? That works great. As I said, you need to ask a focused yes or no question. When you're asking, have multiple answers, that is difficult. I mean, I really can't, you have to break it down. And it really brings up an important point. The astrology really won't do the heavy lifting for you in decision making. The best way to use a horary is to go through all your options and select one based on your normal decision making process. And then use the horary as a way to confirm that as the best outcome. So if you're looking at different cities, or you don't know where to move, work through your process. Say, I want to move to Boston. Ask that as a horary. That's the best way to do it. Now, it is possible you say, well, I could move to Boston, I could move to Cleveland, I could move to Los Angeles. You could ask Boston first, and then, a couple days later ask Cleveland, and then a couple days later ask, your third choice. The problem with that is that as you begin asking more and more of these questions, you lose the emotional punch, and accuracy suffers a certain amount. So it's okay as an option. But you just have to recognize that wouldn't be quite as accurate as asking about your final answer, your final option. And but I certainly will take those questions. Now, another thing that you need to keep in mind is that typically when you're asking a question, there'll be a headline or a main question and a sort of secondary part of it. Now, for example, will I get married and when? Now, will I get married is the main question, and then if you get a yes answer for that, we can go ahead and look and see, well, can we see some timing indications? Timing is pretty tricky. I would say that only actually are timing indications in maybe half the charts, and even in those charts, getting the timing correct can be quite difficult. So, and the same factor applies to lost item questions. And that's probably one of my least favorite type of questions because I'm just not very good at them. But part of the reason is because the real headline question, the lost item question, is will I get the item back? Will it be found? At the same time, the client is really interested in where it is. That's the secondary part. So they're focused on the part of the question that's hardest to figure out. And so again, that makes it harder to get a correct answer. So timing, location, and also physical descriptions are all secondary information and are a lot trickier to figure out in a horary than the main question. So again, that's good to keep in mind. How long does a horary last for? As a general rule, a horary is going to be looking out as far as specific predictive events for maybe 6 to 12 months. If you don't put a time limit on it, you could say, will I get a job in the next month? And of course, then that question is limited to the next month. If you were to get a job, 3 months from now, then that answer would be no. So sometimes you don't want to limit it too much in terms of timing. Basically, when you choose that kind of restriction on the question in terms of time, choose a natural time frame. If it's 6 months, that's fine. If the job is ending in 3 months, that's fine too. But if you don't put a time restriction on it, we're looking at, say, 6 to 12 months. Now, if you ask about a specific person or a specific, say, business deal, often the horary will be definitive because you've limited it to that person or that specific circumstance. If you ask, however, something like a soulmate reading, which is looking over your romantic, general romance for the next, say, 6 to 12 months, then again, that has to have a time limit on it. You can't say, what's my love life, and then get a horary that looks at the whole rest of your life. It has to be limited. And so, it really follows a general principle of the more precise the question, the more precise the answer. The vaguer the question, the vaguer the answer. Now, you can go too far. I've had people that will ask such a precise question that they'll try to control the answer that way, and that doesn't work too well. The classic example of that is that I have people saying in a relationship, well, will he contact me? They're trying to ask a specific question, but in fact, the real question there is, am I going to be able to have a relationship with this person? So again, it can be a little bit of a tricky process. And I encourage people, if they have questions about how to frame the question, to contact me, and I can help you with that process. It's perfectly fine to discuss it, and then I can actually take the question, take the chart, and that is a good way to work through horary questions if you're not really sure how to ask it or how to take the question. The final point I'd like to talk about is when you get the horary back, it's going to include the astrological factors that I looked at, and then an analysis. And it's essentially like getting it in French and English. And sometimes people get nervous about the astrology. You don't have to. You can ignore the astrology, and look just at the analysis. Sometimes I've had people in the past that wanted an explanation of the astrology. To do that properly, to really get an understanding of horary astrology, you need to take my full horary course, and that takes a minimum of 6 months. It's really not possible to give a simplified explanation of the astrology. It's very complex, and you don't really need to worry about that in terms of the analysis. The other problem I've had is occasionally people would get an answer they didn't like, and they would want me to go through line by line and justify, and they would argue with me about my analysis in an attempt to try to get the answer changed from a no to a yes. And so again, that's a little counterproductive. Really, the thing to focus on is the practical implications, the predictive, quality of the analysis. We can talk about concrete events, we can talk about what's likely to happen, and that's probably the most fruitful way of going forward. Because typically the answer to when I say, well, Jupiter in detriment means X. Well, you don't have to worry about Jupiter in detriment because it means X. And it's not surprising you don't understand the astrology because, again, as I said, it takes a lot of time and energy to do that. But I like to put the astrology in. It shows how the process works. It's transparent, and often I have students that are getting horaries. And then also I keep a record of all the readings I do. So it's useful for me to go back and be able to see what my reasoning was in coming up with analysis. So I go back and forth because some clients do find it a little bit disturbing to not understand the astrology. But ultimately, really the best clients appreciate knowing how the analysis was arrived at, and appreciate seeing how I work through my analysis, even if maybe they don't have it mastered themselves. So that's why I continue to include the astrological factors in the analysis. And one thing that does come up frequently, there's a technical type of methodology that I use that talks about whether a chart is radical or not. Radical basically means rooted, and it's just sort of an internal calibration. And so if the chart has this internal calibration and it's a plus, it's nice to have a radical or rooted chart. If it's not radical, it's not a problem. And it's one of those things that we traditionally do it, so I sort of do it as a way of kind of showing some respect for the tradition. And like I said, it's a nice plus. It's not a problem in a chart if it's not radical. It doesn't mean that the chart's not accurate. And so I really have found the Horary to be an amazing tool and incredible guidance in terms of predicting the future. And I'm really happy to be able to provide that to clients. And it's really, it takes a little while to get used to sometimes how to ask a Horary question. But once you do get used to it, many clients come back again and again and again. Because if you think about it, here we've got a way of accurately predicting the future. And whether or not it's going to give us a roadmap to have exactly what we want, in the end, we find it's incredible to have an idea of what's really going to happen. So positive or negative, it's very useful to know the future. And that's exactly what's provided by Horary Astrology. So I hope you found this very useful, and I certainly look forward to having you as a Horary client. And if you want to order a Horary and have questions about how to do it, or questions about how to formulate your question, of course, contact me at renaissanceastrology.com.